Yeah, so
How-
once we
how's-
get a few people joining, I mean, if we just discuss stuff between us whilst we start, like we can find out a bit about you, Mark, for the first few minutes. And have we got the poll question, April?
We do. Do you want me to bring that up now?
Yeah, did you? Well, I was chatting to Gary this morning. We thought that something a bit simpler, a bit more lighthearted would get people thinking. Is the question okay? Do you think it makes people think about the various ethical impacts? Is that maybe something that as a panel we could be discussing in the first few minutes, just whilst people arrive?
Let's do it.
Bear with me. Let me bring it up. Bring it up for everybody. Hang on. And then
Mark, how's the storm in the Netherlands?
Oh, it's horrific. Yeah, it's terrible. My partner had to leave work early.
Oh, right.
It's just really bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So, at the moment we are still, we are fairly all right here. It seems to be further south, the main part. Oh, right. Whoa. Zoom features. We've got a poll open here. It just popped right into my face.
Gary and I were working on this morning.
Makes a decision the farmer disagrees with. Who should have the final say, robot or farmer? I can't vote.
Neither. I thought it was interesting because one or the other may have more data available or information or experience available than the other. And what should you do in conflicts like that? And would it be right of a robot to let a farmer make a bad decision, in a sense? Are these valid thought streams, Mark? Are we picking up?
Yeah. That'll be one of the aspects of my talk today. So in relation to the freedom and autonomy of the farmer. So how much control and say does the farmer have over his own farm, especially when autonomous robots are implemented? And yeah, this sort of harks back to the self-driving vehicle as well. Like once self-driving vehicles reach level 4, there's a lot of talk that drivers should be prohibited from driving because the self-driving vehicle is a much safer alternative. So like, why would you let someone into a car driving in an automobile that's much less safe than a self-driving vehicle?
Yeah.
But this is sort of future postulations when self-driving vehicles reach that level of autonomy.
I think you're currently biasing the answers here. That's probably okay.
Can they hear?
Yeah, we've got 14 people in attendance now.
Oh, okay.
We've got people coming in. We've got people popping in now.
Rachel joined the panel as well.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So for the benefit of people attending this talk today, I am James. I'm hosting the talk. I am a member of the CDT, currently studying at the MSc in Lincoln, part of cohort 3, and we're fortunate to have Mark with us today, a researcher in ethics. Mark, maybe you could, whilst we're waiting, just tell a bit about how you got into that. What's the thing you most love about studying ethics?
Yeah, sort of a bit of a broad question, but yeah, it's what I have my background training in. So I did my degree in humanities, then a master's in ethics, culture and global change, and my PhD in environmental ethics. And since my PhD for the past maybe 7 years, 8 years, I've just focused more on digital ethics. So everything pertaining to digital ethics, from data sharing to robots to IoT technologies to AI. And since I moved to Wageningen, I've just focused more so on the social and ethical impacts of AI in the agricultural sector. So yeah, I just find it fascinating in general, especially with AI and the potential decisions and issues that it may involve, like in the future. So I'm just fascinated in the overall area of ethics and technology generally.
Brilliant. For the extra people joining us, you might notice that we've got a little poll question. Hopefully that pops up somewhere for you. Maybe you could answer this. This is just to get ideas flowing about what ethical implications there are of robotics and AI in agriculture. Gary, you've popped up. Have you got any thoughts about the question? What issues does it raise?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on the panel. So my name's Gary Clausen. I'm part of the CDT cohort 3 with James and Rachel. So thanks for having me here. So this is really interesting for me. It's a question I suppose everyone's sort of struggled with. I'm going to today, because it's today's decision, I'm going to go with the robot. So tomorrow I'll probably go with the farmer. But yeah, today I think the robot should, because the farmer sort of delegated that in the instant that they purchased it. But there's a few caveats around this, because you know, if like a Tesla and you've got a forced update, then you know, then how does hardware and software interact, and what's the responsibility of, you know, the manufacturer and whatnot. So it's quite a tricky question. So really looking forward to listening to Mark's talk today, and to sort of see the nuances around this. So that'd be really good.
Absolutely. Looks like we've still got a few people joining, but I'm going to say this is the last chance for you to answer the poll. Then perhaps we can close that in a minute.
So what are your thoughts, James?
That is an interesting question. I don't know what I'd choose. I think which is kind of why I picked the question. There's situations where the robot might have more data available than the farmer, or the farmer might have better experience, but it certainly raises conflicts. And is it ethical for the robot to let the farmer make a decision it knows is wrong? But equally, do we have enough trust in robots?
Don't answer all the questions that Mark is going to answer. Let him do some of them. Let him do some of the hard work.
Right. If we could close that poll and maybe the result appears to us. Ooh, Gary, you're on your own.
I wasn't allowed to vote.
Oh,
so
you weren't
there's someone else out there.
But anyway, with that, we will hand over to our speaker today. He can pick up those results and let us know much more about it. I want to introduce Mark, and I'll let him, Mark Ryan, that is, not our CDT director, let us know much more about who he is. Maybe you could spend a couple minutes just introducing yourself, and then give us the talk considering the various ethical impacts of using artificial intelligence in the agricultural sector. So over to you, Mark. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Sure. Can everyone see my screen now? Full presentation mode?
Absolutely. Perfect.
Okay. Great. So the talk today is focusing on the ethical and social impacts of AI in the agri-food sector. And as As I was introduced, my name is Dr. Mark Ryan, and I work for Wageningen University and Research. I work in Wageningen Economic Research specifically, and my main area of focus is on the social and ethical impacts of digitalization and technologies broadly construed. So I'm not sure if many of you heard from the beginning. So my background is in environmental ethics. I did my PhD in it, but since the past 7 or 8 years since, I've been working on digital ethics. So more or less focusing on digital ethics within many different domains and applications, from self-driving vehicles to robots to AI recommendation systems, but also in many different domains as well. So I've analyzed AI and smart technologies within smart cities, within the agricultural sector, within the healthcare sector, and within industry. But since my time in Wageningen University and Research, because of the nature of the university, I've had much stronger focus on the agri-food sector. So 4 key publications that may be relevant for this talk, but also for if you want to do further research on the topic. These are 4 publications that I have in relation to ethical and digital impacts of using technologies within the agri-food sector. So the first publication, it's my most recent one, and that will be the focus for today's talk. It's the social and ethical impacts of artificial intelligence in agriculture, mapping the agricultural AI literature. So just to begin with, one of the main focuses of the research and aims of today's presentation is to provide all of you with an overview of the main social and ethical impacts of AI in the agricultural sector. And for my research, which was published in AI and Society, I conducted a thematic analysis of 11 overarching ethical principles: transparency, justice and fairness, non-maleficence, responsibility, privacy, beneficence, freedom and autonomy, trust, dignity, sustainability, and solidarity. So I analyzed these 11 overarching principles within the context of what has been said within the literature on the topic of AI ethics in agriculture. And I contrasted this with 84 AI ethics guidelines. So these are just general AI ethics guidelines. You might have came across a few of them, such as the high-level expert groups, EU trustworthy AI ethics guidelines, and then a lot of organizations have their own individual ones, such as Microsoft, Facebook, Sony, Google, and so forth. So the main aim of my paper and this presentation is to try to identify how much or how many of these overarching ethical issues or themes are relevant or have been discussed within the literature on agricultural AI ethics, and how does this contrast to AI ethics guidelines. So are AI ethics guidelines representative of AI ethics in agriculture, and how can the two relate? So just a very quick overview of what ethics is, just in case some of you are unfamiliar with the term. So ethics evaluates what is meant to live a good life, how to live a good life, and why we should even care about it. So it means distinguishing between right and wrong conduct and determining ways we should behave in certain circumstances and contexts. So in a nutshell, it's determining what's right and wrong and what's good and bad in a particular situation. So in ethics, there's many different types of frameworks that have been employed down throughout the centuries. 3 of the most prominent ones would be virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. So virtue ethics, one of its main goals is to identify what a virtuous person would do in a particular situation. Deontology has more distinctive rules, such as what is right and wrong conduct. So, for example, the commandments would be an example of deontology. You should not do this, you should not do that. And it's very clear-cut ethical rules, regardless of the consequences or the situation or the context. And then thirdly, there's utilitarianism, which it focuses on what's the best outcome of the situation for the most amount of people. So utilitarianism may allow for bombings of a certain country if it's for the benefit of the overall global population. This is just a very crude example. Or you could kill someone and use all of their organs to save the lives of 5 or 6 other people. So utilitarianism looks for what's the best outcome for the most amount of people, but it also has some sort of negative or dubious or unethical consequences in practice. But this paper will take a more pragmatic view of ethics. So it will evaluate what are the most prevalent and significant issues, values, and morals being discussed in AI agriculture without necessarily taking an overarching framework such as virtue ethics, deontology, or utilitarianism. So the methodology that I employed in my research, so I used these 11 thematic principles that I discussed earlier, and these were first established in an article by Jobin et al. And these 11 principles, they emerged from a content analysis of the 84 AI ethics guidelines that Jobin and her cohorts analyzed. So these 11 principles frame the literature found on AI ethics. And what I tried to do was evaluate how they're being evaluated in the AI ethics literature within the agricultural sector. So there's very little information and very little publications on the topic of AI ethics in agriculture. I was only able to find really maybe 21 relevant articles, and these were covered using the PRISMA method in order to evaluate whether or not they were ethical, whether or not they had relevance to the agricultural sector, and whether or not they're focusing on AI. And I used the Maxted 2020 data analytics software using both lexical searches and contextual analysis of the text with the 11 principles that I mentioned earlier, and also with synonyms. So this is a very broad overview of some of the main findings. So if you can see on the middle column, it's the amount of times that these particular concepts, these principles, were found in the 21 papers that I analyzed, the 21 AI ethics agricultural papers. And this is contrasted to many times these concepts emerge within the 84 AI ethics guidelines. So as you can see, there's some correlation, but there's also a lot of divergence as well. So for example, sustainability was by far the most cited and deemed to be the most relevant and important topic within the literature on agricultural AI ethics, where it has had much less of an importance within the AI ethics guidelines that I analyzed. And then you can see at the bottom, topics such as solidarity and dignity were quite sparsely commented upon within the agricultural literature, but also within the AI ethics guidelines. So there was some symmetry there. But another interesting thing is that transparency was discussed very widely within the AI ethics guidelines. It was the most discussed principle within the AI ethics guidelines, but it was very little, very sparsely covered within the documents on AI ethics within agriculture. So this is just a very broad overview of some of the main ethical principles that were covered, but I think this is a nice visualization of how the two diverged, and I'll go through it in further detail now. So in relation to sustainability, some of the main findings within the literature on AI in agriculture is that AI must surpass current agricultural sustainability. So there's a clear emphasis within the literature that AI must not only be as environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable and socially sustainable as current practices, it must actually surpass these because of the dependence and reliance on the agricultural sector to feed a growing population within the coming decades. So it's not good enough for AI to simply be as good or less than good than current precision agricultural endeavors. Secondly, robots, sensors, and drones also hold the potential to leak fluid, toxic chemicals, emit fumes, and so forth on the farm, as well as cause issues such as surface water runoff, encroachment on habitats, or general pollution to the surrounding area. There's also a sustainability concern about soil compaction from the use of heavy machinery on the farm. And another very interesting insight that was gathered through the literature analysis was that there's a lot of debate and speculation within the industry that because certain robots find it difficult to maneuver within greenhouses or to retrieve tomatoes without damaging them. There's some discussions about perhaps genetic modification of the plants, of the fruit of the vegetables should be done in order to better accommodate the robots. So there's kind of a reversal rather than the robots being designed to carry out and retrieve natural products. We should instead reverse this somehow and genetically modify plants, fruits, and vegetables in order for robots to successfully retrieve them. Another topic that kept popping up was the issue of non-maleficence. So when I speak of non-maleficence, basically it means to avoid harm, to do no harm. So AI robots may reduce toxic chemicals and pesticides, thus protecting farmers from harmful health impacts. So this is a very positive thing that AI robots may be able to bring about. And there's also the idea that AI may reduce accidents on the farm that would also be caused by human error. So the guys spoke about this briefly at the start of the presentation. So if we can implement AI on the farm to reduce accidents, to reduce harm to the farmer, then this is a clear benefit. It'll reduce accidents and reduce issues such as these. However, there's also a risk that AI itself may distress or harm livestock and wildlife on the farm. And there's also the issue that harm may be done to the farmer or the farm because a farm is more vulnerable to hacking, sabotaging, and spying with the increased digitalization of the farm through the use of agricultural robots and AI. And the third principle that I want to focus on is in relation to trust. So building trust in agriculture is often very challenging. This came up in a lot of my previous research, not necessarily focusing on AI, but very much focused on data sharing. Throughout Europe, there's a lot of mistrust towards the government, towards collectives, towards ICT companies that are attempting to retrieve data. So AI may be something that will actually increase trust in one way. So there's a more proven way to farm more efficiently. If this can be shown to farmers, this may actually increase trust within the sector. However, there's also the possibility that AI may actually increase distrust of agribusinesses and tech companies. So what type of data are the companies retrieving? What are they doing with it? And how are they going to benefit from it? So trust is very commonly discussed within the ethics of agricultural data sharing, but less so in agricultural AI. Another thematic topic is the principle of beneficence. So beneficence is essentially the opposite of non-maleficence. So beneficence means to do good. So to do good, to ensure that people benefit from AI. So one of the main questions is who exactly will benefit from agricultural AI? Will it be the farmers, or will it just be agribusinesses? Will it be tech companies? So there should be a co-creating method with developers and farmers to ensure that farmers can benefit from the use of AI. So it's also important to identify the needs of the farmers before developing technologies that they will use. Another topic that kept coming up in the literature, and this was a new one for me, was the farmers felt that often there's a pressure on them to adopt AI technologies and to digitalize for the common good or the industry. And if they don't do this, they're seen as Luddites and backward, and that they're a burden on the industry. So there's a real pressure on farmers to digitalize and further technologize their businesses and their farm. And fifthly, so how can farmers retain control of their farms with AI? So this is a very important topic as well, ensuring the freedom and autonomy of farmers. So some companies actually prohibit farmers from repairing or tampering with AI hardware, which they purchase and use on their farm, and thus this impacts the farmer's freedom. So farmers essentially give over their control of the farm to AI decision making because it is seen as more scientifically valid, or because they invested a lot of money in it and they feel guilty and pressured into adopting and accepting the decision making that's being implemented by the AI on their farm. Another topic is the issue of privacy. So what type of data is retrieved, how will it be transferred, stored, used, and repurposed? So farmers must, when they use AI on farms, they must trade off some level of privacy for the benefits and promises of AI on the farm. One study that I analyzed showed that 78% of farmers are concerned about their data being shared and sold by corporations. And seventh, justice and fairness was an important topic as well. So if AI is only deployed on rich, large, monocultural farms, then this seriously limits the uptake of AI by smaller farms, poorer farmers, and the global south. So who has access to AI is important. Is it affordable? Can it be used by people? Will it be translated into other languages, and how accessible will it be are very important themes. So Carolyn stated that in addition, because of the historically low numbers of women in STEM and also in farming, that the increased integration of technologies on the farm may further worsen the number of women in agriculture. So Carolyn said that it may exacerbate the acceptability or the attractiveness of farming for women in the sector, because the mutual technology and the already low numbers of women in STEM and farming. So, and in relation to responsibility, Pioneer and Monsanto require their AI customers to be prior customers of their seeds, and John Deere make farmers sign licensing agreements that say that they will not sue the company if there is damage to their crops, land, profit, machines, or businesses because of their AI. So it's becoming a very difficult and challenging situation for some farmers. They're required to have greater responsibility and greater accountability for what occurs in their farms, even though, if you remember from the previous slide, they're not allowed to tamper with the machinery in a lot of instances. They're not able to make changes, and sometimes they just have to basically ensure that the land is navigatable and usable by the AI in the farms. Transparency was a concern in relation to the interpretability and understandability of the data being retrieved from AI systems, and if these recommendations are accurate. So there was a lot of problems within the literature that farmers were worried that they will be unable to understand what the AI is recommending. They will be unable to understand how it's interacting and moving, and the decisions that it provides on the farm. And there's also needs to be a greater level of education, training, and understandability of AI in order for farmers to be able to understand and work with AI on the farms. But there's kind of there's two positions within the literature. One kind of emphasizes that farmers need to upskill, they need to become more educated in computer science. And then there's another position that states that it's really the roboticists and the computer scientists' responsibility to make the technologies really accessible, understandable, and usable by the end user rather than the other way around. In relation to solidarity and the next topic, dignity, they didn't really come up in the documents that I analyzed. The solidarity was only mentioned twice, and the lack of solidarity references in the literature is possibly because AI in agriculture is a relatively new topic, and solidarity is not necessarily a theme that is often widely discussed in AI ethics in general. But I ask, so could AI and robots improve or harm solidarity within a community? What type of impact could AI have on farming communities, particularly regional ones? And also in recent research that I've been doing with roboticists around Europe, one of the feelings was that in some countries it can improve solidarity, while in other countries it can harm solidarity. So the two examples I gave were with roboticists in Greece. So we had workshops with these roboticists, and they said because I think it was something like 70% of the population have worked in the agricultural sector, or their families have worked in the agricultural sector, they know the hardship, the burden, physical burden of using robots within agriculture. So it builds a better sense of community and solidarity when everyone is able to use robots to reduce these type of burdens. Whereas in other countries, I gave the example of Spain and Morocco. So one concern was that if robots are used more frequently and more commonly within Spain, this will reduce the need for Moroccan seasonal workers. So it may, as a result, impact the Moroccan economy, where a lot of seasonal workers are dependent on the money, and their families are dependent on the money that they get from working on farms in Spain. So this could have communal tensions between Spain and Morocco as a result. In relation to dignity, so dignity is often not widely discussed in the AI ethics literature, but more so in other domains such as healthcare. It's very common in AI ethics and healthcare. AI in agriculture does not have the same kind of dignity infringing potential as healthcare. So it's not dealing with vulnerable patients, life-threatening diseases. So these kind of worries where you do not want to burden the patient or infringe on their sense of self-worth or dignity. However, this does not mean that dignity is irrelevant for the agricultural sector. It should still be a concern, how AI impacts and infringes on farmers' role and their profession and their sense of dignity. So one of the concerns that was sometimes appears is that farmers will simply become AI babysitters on the farm, that they'll lose their sense of worth, they'll lose what it means to be a farmer, and they'll be more or less just accommodating the robot or the AI decision making on their farm. So in the discussion, the contrast between the AI ethics guidelines and also the AI ethics literature on agriculture, two particularly interesting things arose or popped up. So what arose in the AI ethics literature on agriculture, but which was not a focus on the 84 AI ethics guidelines, were that there was a strong emphasis in the agricultural literature on the impact of AI on species and sustainability and the environment. And this is definitely something that should be incorporated more so within national and private AI ethics guidelines. So it's really interesting to see that the agricultural literature is really emphasizing and leading the way on sustainability topics. Also, animal welfare did not really come up within the AI ethics guidelines, but was a very important concern within the agricultural literature. And finally, there was little reference to employment within the AI ethics guidelines, despite this being one of the most important themes within the debate in an agricultural context. And in contradistinction to this, So the topics that arose within the AI ethics guidelines, but did not appear within the agricultural AI ethics literature, mostly focused on the topics of transparency and also dignity and solidarity. So in relation to transparency, it was rarely discussed, despite this being a very important topic in most forms of ethical practice in digital technology development and use. It's quite common in like all other domains of application, but it was unusual that it didn't really appear very often within the agricultural literature. And finally, dignity and solidarity did not arise much at all, but it also didn't arise much within the AI ethics guidelines. So that's my presentation for today. If anyone wants to get in touch about any of the topics, or you want a copy of one of the papers that I've written, my email is mark.ryan@ver.nl, or my Twitter handle is markryanethics. Okay, I will stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really enjoyed that and brought a lot of new points to my attention. So we're going to move to a panel discussion and Q&A. Everyone is welcome to ask questions through the Q&A functionality of Zoom. So please start putting your questions or even just comments and opinions in there. And let us introduce the panel for today. So Rachel, start with you.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Rachel Tribble. I'm part of cohort 3 as well. We're an active bunch. Yeah, so thank you very much for your talk, Mark. Yeah, as James said, yeah, a lot of interesting points. I wondered if you could talk maybe a little bit more about the ownership of the technology and the data there, and what that means in terms of the balance of power in society and preventing bread riots and such like. What's your opinion on that aspect of the topic?
Yeah, it's quite a complicated one. In the US, it's a bit of a disaster, like in a lot of ways. So it's kind of a mixed model approach where the organizations retain ownership of the products, and a lot of times farmers just lease them out. And I think in Europe it might be slightly different, but because of the innovativeness of the technology, there's no real regulation that's been enforced in a very strict sense at the moment. But yeah, it can certainly impact how farmers are able to implement it and whether or not it's affordable. So if there's huge investment costs to begin with, it's automatically going to wipe many people out from being able to use these type of technologies. So this leads to a lot of people in the literature saying that it should be a kind of lease model, or dependent on what type of return on investments that the farmer receives, in order to make it more attractive and more beneficial for farmers in the global south, or farmers on smaller farms, rather than just being used on large monocultural farms.
So the lease model helps with access for so the big companies would still own the technology and the kit, but the leasing would at least allow people to get access to that with kind of reduced investment.
Yeah, but this also, as you mentioned, like it leads to a lot of issues in relation to power asymmetry and control. So what can the large organizations do with these technologies? What type of data can they retrieve? And one of the issues that kept popping up in the literature as well is that they bombard farmers with these insane legal documents that the farmers aren't really able to interpret, and basically the farmers signing off their life away in a nutshell, like in relation to what the technologies can do and can't do. And there's also the issue that I mentioned that a lot of companies in the US, like John Deere, they're basically saying, okay, you need to sign on the dotted line that we're not going to be held responsible or accountable for whatever our tractors do on your farm, or whatever our technologies do on your farm. So it's a bit of a problematic area.
I mean, is there anything? Were there any recommendations that came out of the literature?
There wasn't, unfortunately. The literature is very sparse at the moment, and one of the issues with ethicists, they often just tend to focus on the problems and challenges rather than necessarily coming up with really good solutions. So that's one part of my work at the moment. I'm working with focus groups and of roboticists around Europe, and we're trying to identify possible solutions and ways around some of these power differences and challenges.
Cool, thanks. That sounds really interesting.
I know that, Gary, I think, did you have queries similar to that? Did you want to introduce yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, no problem. So again, fantastic talk, Mark. It's a lot left of, there's a lot of thinking that I suppose I've got to go away and do. I certainly had a question around dignity and item sort of 11. We certainly work with human in the loop sort of processes, but I've got a background in manufacturing, and the transition to sort of automation is something that's been occurring there for the last 40 years. It's not something new where you would be a machine babysitter as such, in that context. I wondered if you had a perspective on that. Is there something analogous that you can sort of move across? Because it doesn't seem a new problem to me. It seems something that really is a really old problem that just needs transitioning. So I wondered your perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the points I tried to mention within the slide as well. So it didn't come up in the literature, but this definitely doesn't mean that it's not important. It's just a topic that wasn't necessarily evaluated within the 21 papers that I looked at. But certainly in a lot of other research, it goes back decades, it's not centuries, this idea of dignity, particularly in the healthcare sector. So it's just a matter of bringing over these findings and things like value sensitive design, and integrating these within the agricultural sector and within the design and deployment of AI.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting sort of parallel. Is there anything that you imagine would be sort of in the future literature around this? The term AI babysitters was sort of evocative in that sense. So I wondered if that was purposely put in there or not.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was put in. But it was one of the phrases that came up within one of the focus groups with a roboticist from the UK, and I just liked the way that he phrased it, so I said I would use it in the presentation as well. This idea that you're just following around the robot around the farm and making sure that no leaves or no things get caught in its wheels, and just ensuring that everything is okay and the parameters for the robot are maneuverable. Rather than necessarily concentrating on the aspects of your farming that you once enjoyed doing.
Brilliant, great, thank you. I think there's some great questions in the panel as well, so thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to, from the panel, put a quick one in on a similar vein. I'll just read it out. What role could open source robotics play in terms of protecting farmers' rights, particularly picking up what you were saying about examples of John Deere and making them sign their lives away and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And this came up in one of the focus groups as well. So there was this emphasis that perhaps if the technology and the background technology becomes more open access, then it improves better accessibility. It's cheaper to use and integrate. But what my issue still was, you still need the hardware in a lot of instances, and the hardware is still going to be quite costly to produce. But certainly this is one of the ways to overcome some of the poverty challenges, say when it's being integrated in the global south, or even within poorer farms across Europe. Open access software, definitely, but it still boils down to the challenge of needing robots, the physical technology. But there's a lot of instances where open access AI recommendation systems are being used by farmers, particularly in India and China, and they're being used very effectively. But yeah, this is definitely helpful for overcoming some of the economic challenges, but also, as the commenter says, power differences as well.
Brilliant. So quite a big question from the panel, from Sean. The underlying assumption seems that to make AI, sorry, let me start again. I'm doing a terrible job of reading that. The underlying assumption seems to be that AI will make better decisions than the farmer. Is there any data to back this assumption up?
Yeah.
Maybe
very good
Mark
question.
Hanheider, did you want to join in this discussion as well?
If I find my unmute button, indeed. I don't know. Is there data to back this assumption? Let me think. Anyone who knows of any cases, that would be helpful. I think there's depends on how much far you want it to go, right? So there is certainly, and I see that also Richard Harvey is part of one of our audience today, and we're talking a lot about challenges that we have in, for instance, forecasting yield in farms, right? And there's there may be indications there that some of the AI models are doing a better job than robots are doing, for instance. And we've seen this overall, of course, that in so many areas of machine learning that there is a chance that an AI does a better job than an average human, not necessarily than a very specific person, but that on a kind of global level, that they may be able to do a better job in various. So I think you could say there is in general data there and evaluations there that clearly indicate that AI can do a better job in specific areas. And as such, you could say, yeah, you could say that because on average, this is the same argument that Mark made earlier on about the driving on level 4, right? Which is on average, statistically, an autonomous car will be much better than a human driver. So it would be foolish to have an average human driver car. It's still a statistical argument in the end, right? And I think this would have been my question to Mark as well, that we can always, that in many these discussions that I see in computer science and AI about ethics, they come down to a statistical argument. While often in ethics, you're interested in the special case, right? About when you have to take this decision in this very awkward situation, this one that nobody had expected, which is the real tough one, which can then lead to the wrong choices. So I think in principle, yeah, you could say there is evidence that AI can take better decisions in a statistical sense.
Mark?
I would say in some situations, in some contexts, and then in others completely not. So for example, within the focus groups that we had, like a lot of the computer scientists said that the jobs that their AI technologies are doing were not done or cannot be done by humans. So you're collecting, for example, real-time data. So some of these things are just outside the sheer scope of human capacity. But then in other instances, say for example, I remember seeing technologies that detect disease on plants using by taking a picture of them. And as you know from this type of software, so much can go wrong, and so often it may not be very accurate, where a farmer could look at a leaf straight away and go, yeah, the plant is clearly ill. So there's always going to be kind of discrepancies. Sometimes humans are far better at machines at certain tasks, and in other instances, AI it appears that it'll be far more compatible or far more efficient. So it depends. It goes back to the point of trying to use AI and technologies in an efficient way and a respectable way for the farmer as well, rather than undermining their sense of dignity and autonomy. But it's also goes back to what's most beneficial and what's most helpful for the farmer. So if it's a decision that they can make themselves and that's easy to make, then the AI doesn't necessarily have to tell them every single thing to do on the farm. But certainly for crop predictions and crop yields, things like this, there's a lot of there's a lot of gray room for maneuver. Like it's a bit unclear like how accurate the AI is to predict these kind of things, as opposed to like a farmer who's worked the land for like decades and knows their farm inside out and takes into account all of these sort of idiosyncrasies with their land, their climate. So there's no clear cut and easy solution to that or answer.
Richard Harvey has well, it's a comment combined with a question, so I'll read that out, and I think I'll wrap this train of questioning up nicely. So Richard says, I'm curious about the interplay of ethics and computer science. On the one hand, computer scientists seem to think about ethical considerations very late. On the other, working with ethicists is annoying because they work slowly, and already mentioned, they tend to criticize things without creating solutions. I wonder, Mark, if you have any thoughts about how the two types of people can work better together.
Get better ethicists. Ethicists shouldn't really be working in that kind of way, but I understand the point. There should be kind of driven towards some kind of solution. So it is very problem focused a lot of times, but a lot of times it's for good reason. To identify problems before they occur with the technologies. So I think both disciplines could certainly benefit from interacting and also maybe taking a leaf out of each other's book. So instead of the build things fast, move fast, break things attitude, they could slow down a little, and perhaps ethicists could speed up and be a bit more pragmatic about how to find solutions and ways forward.
Brilliant.
I'm pretty sure some people on the call would not like to hear the slowing down prospect. It's a difficult thing. There's a craving for technology to advancing, and it's always a tricky race, right, for ethics to catch up in that set. Well, not even to catch up, to not be left behind. I think this is a very systemic problem.
Yeah, I think like just a sort of interdisciplinary approach is very practical and beneficial as well. So like having ethicists like from the start, or even contacting ethicists about how particular technology is developing or what its design is going to be would certainly be beneficial. But even if you don't want to get involved with ethicists because they're too slow and annoying, at least ensuring that you do like a lot of dialogue with the end user would be very beneficial for your the development of your technology. So identifying the different stakeholders involved and how they may be affected, because that's all ethics is at the end of the day, trying to identify who's impacted, how, and will it be positive or negative? How can you reduce some of the burdens and some of the harms before they occur, and how can you try to eliminate them altogether?
Great. I've got a question from Frederick for the whole panel. So regarding AI, and more specifically the physical hardware, what is the panel's opinion of autonomous units and the timeline we may begin to see greater numbers of them operating within agriculture? Currently, commercialization seems in early days, but we are beginning to see them appear, especially on heavily labor-reliant farms such as salad or fruit crops. So the panel's opinion on timelines.
This reminds me of when will cars be fully autonomous type question.
Yeah, very interesting question. Is there on the autonomous car side, you mentioned sort of level 4, level 3, level 4, is there an equivalent for sort of farming in that sense? Mark, do you know of, is there some sort of guide that can help inform this question where we can run some guesses? The
levels is retrieved from a document by the German government, and it differentiates the different stages of autonomy, going from 0, which is, your car that's like 20 years old that has 0 automation, and then level 5 is just completely autonomous. You don't have to do anything, you just get in the car and go. Level 3 is kind of a mixed model where you have to constantly be engaged in case the car needs your attention. So like it's autonomous, but you still have to react if the car malfunctions or deviates from its route. I don't know of any similar applications within the agricultural domain, but this same process could be applied to like self-driving tractors, for example, or self-driving agricultural machinery.
So I've just put in the chat a model that we've been recently looking into a bit more in the context of agriculture. So this is again coming from the automotive industry. It's these SAE levels of autonomy. Not sure if they are the same, but they also go from 0 to 5. I think that may exactly be the same.
It's the same. Yeah.
It's not just the German thing. I think this is
it's global. Yeah.
Exactly. And just so if anyone is interested to look a bit more into that, it's quite topical, right? The automotive industry is quite a bit ahead, if you want, in that definition, and also to ensure, and in particular to also provide assurance and therefore insurance of these autonomous vehicles on roads than we are. And so recently, just in the automotive sector, there's been a new government policy document came out again for vehicles on roads. There's a bit of catching up that the agri sector in that sense has to do, but I can tell that we've actually I can say that as much as that we've actually just submitted a grant to look into that a little more in detail, based around the levels of autonomy as they are defined in this SAE document. So one can learn quite a bit from that, but there's, in many ways, the agricultural sector is even harder. It's less controlled, and you have, and there's also less of an awareness. I think this is the problem. Like, you would never, or well, hardly anyone would ever just run across a road because they know there's a car potentially coming. While you have got lots of public right-of-ways crossing our farms, where you don't you expect probably a big machinery at the moment to come along, and you would hear it from half a mile away if it's a combine harvester or something like this, or a tractor. If it's an electrical robot whizzing about, you may not exactly be prepared for it. So there's quite a bit of challenges and other use cases that one needs to look at. And in particular, we have problems already these days with deer crossing the road and causing accidents. You won't believe how many of those type of things you get in the field. So it's not only harm to humans that is a potential problem, it's also a much more harm to other living beings that just happen to be around.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask one last question in a minute, but I just wanted to thank everyone for all the questions and comments, and apologize that we haven't got to all of them. But Mark, perhaps you could answer this as you close, and maybe add any other closing remarks that you'd like to. So how should a roboticist assess the ethics of introducing an AI or robot to a farm? Is there a particular risk assessment style, or is it as simple as, is the farmers happy, it's ethical?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think working along with farmers is definitely a good solution, but as I mentioned earlier, like identifying early in the process with stakeholders involves how the robot's going to be used, how are they going to benefit from it, whether or not it's going to be usable and accessible. These type of topics are definitely relevant and pertinent for the introduction of robots on farms. Also, there's like ethics risk impact assessments as well that you can use. So like there's protocols that you can go through. There's many different AI ethics guidelines, like the ones that I mentioned in the document, like the high-level expert group, like have a type of protocol, a checklist at the bottom of their documents that a roboticist could also duplicate and use. But I think one of the most important things is just ensuring that all of the issues are discussed and identified before they're actually introduced onto the farms. So ensuring that involving stakeholders to have interactive discussions and and then obviously communicate with the farmer once the robot's actually introduced as well, see what their concerns are, see is it fine, see is it usable, see is it working as it should, and so forth.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Mark. It's been interesting. I've learned something. And thank you as well to our panel, Gary, Rachel, and Mark. Thank you very much. I've got a few announcements to make as we close up, and I think there's a slide coming up, but you'll be able to catch up with this talk and our previous talks on YouTube, and you can join us next month for a talk from Aisha Kukukilmaz from the University of Nottingham, who's an assistant professor of robotics and autonomous systems. And the talk will be about dynamic role allocation and shared control in human-robot collaborative teamwork. So we have the date, the 18th of March. And I think the final thing to mention is for anyone who's not part of the CDT, that recruitment for the 4th cohort is open, and you can find out more information on the website. So thank you everyone for joining. Have a good afternoon, and thank you very much to our panel and Mark once again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a lovely weekend.